Welcome to Modern Marketing Messages, the leading podcast discussing the latest and greatest in both online and offline marketing tactics, strategies, and trends. I'm your host, Taylor Karg, marketing content writer at AmericanEagle.com. Today, we're going to discuss personas, including what they are, how to create them for your website, how to utilize them to benefit your business, and so much more. To do that, I have here with me AmericanEagle.com strategist, Joel Rose. Joel, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Can you explain a little bit about, your role, how long you've been at the company? Let's talk about your responsibilities as a strategist and like what that even means, because I feel like that can mean so many different things. And then to cap it all off, just a little bit about your background and kind of what brought you here today.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've been here for it'll be actually 15 years in September.
Wow, I didn't know it was that long.
Yeah, it's gone quickly. It's amazing. You blink and suddenly you've been here a decade.
Yeah.
But it's been a great experience all 15 years. I've learned so much. I've been able to contribute on so many different projects, which has been really great. So in strategy, which I've been doing strategy for probably 7 to 8 years now.
Oh, so you weren't doing that the whole time you were here?
Right.
Oh, wow.
When I first started, we actually had a sports department because we had so many professional sports teams. All of that changed. The league started taking those in-house because they wanted revenue from ads and all of that kind of thing. But we used to do a lot with pro teams. So I did a lot with some NFL teams. And then once everything shifted and those started to go in-house over to the NFL, I jumped over to e-commerce. And after that, I spent some time over in inside sales, doing some more management and project management, and then from there into strategy.
Oh, wow. So you've done quite a few things here.
I have everything from account management, project management, front-end development, Flash, when that was actually a thing.
Oh,
and now I'm in strategy. So all of those experiences have really helped because I understand different sides of projects. So that's been a benefit.
So what are your responsibilities as a strategist? Like, what does that mean in your role today?
Sure. So strategists tend to be the first boots on the ground along with the project manager with the different clients. So we go in and we have to really set up the project for success. So we do a lot with, sometimes it gets into determining business rules for how the business is run, and especially with us, like how that impacts the website. It gets into analytics, things like information architecture, which is the structure, the content structure of the site. So that can be both the navigation, the on-page structure for that content and things like that. A lot of diagrams, processes, things like that. And one of the key things I've done a lot over the years is what we call a foundational document.
Okay.
And that's more trying to capture all of essentially the facts that we all agree on, that we all understand. And part of that are personas. So over the years, I've been able to do that quite a bit. And it's been an evolving science when it comes to doing that for websites. So it's been a great experience.
Awesome. So you're the right guy to have on this episode today to talk all about website personas. So let's just jump right in. And can you explain what personas are? And I know there are typically, in an agency setting like this, two different kinds of personas, marketing, and then there's also web personas. Can you explain a little bit about those?
Sure. So from a high level, personas are groups of users that you're engaging with. Now, for marketers, that gets into who you're marketing to. Typically these days we're talking about online marketing.
Yeah.
For websites, it's once the users get there, those are the personas you want to define. And the personas get a lot into where users are coming from, essentially, like what they need, what problems they're dealing with, why they may be interested in your products or services, and trying to really just define who they are so you can better speak to them.
So why are personas important, and why do you think businesses need them, especially, in this day and age when everybody, hopefully has a website?
Sure. So without personas, you have so many people who touch a website, whether that's software people, but especially when it comes to what faces, the end users, you have the graphics folks who are doing the designs, You have people who are sometimes doing layout, user experience, also, of course, content. So without defining personas, everybody kind of has their own ideas about who these people are. So personas do a great job of capturing uh, all the things that you know about these different types of users in a way that everybody can use as a reference. So they're all coming from the same place, and it helps to really unify things and make sure that you are, engaging with users the best way possible.
Would you say that's kind of like the end goal of a persona is to engage with the end users and make sure that they're, able to complete an action within any given website?
Yeah, absolutely. Whether you're talking about digital marketing or a website, that's the end goal. Is you want to make sure that what you are putting out there resonates with them and it makes sense to them and it meets them where they are.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to creating personas, where should a business start? What are the key steps into creating personas?
Yeah, great question. So one thing I always like to say, this always comes up within the first usually 30 minutes of talking to clients about personas, is you're never going to account for 100% of the users. There's
Yeah.
always edge cases. You can drive yourself crazy trying to account for all of them. And so don't do that. So you definitely want to, as long as you hit, say, somewhere around 80% of your users, I think, you have a lot of room for success there.
Yeah.
So when you really set out to do it, the first thing you want to do is start gathering data. And many times companies, they might not even realize that first, but they might have a lot of data already available to them in their company. So that can be things like looking at sometimes previous strategies. If they go back 4 or 5 years, maybe there was some strategy work done that has some personas, and they could start with that. Now, obviously, they're going to be doing a lot of updates and reviewing them, but it's a starting point. The other thing that you really want to spend time on is trying to determine, what data you have and what can you get.
Mm.
And one thing that's true with personas is you'll never have too much data. Now, you might find some that you end up not using. Maybe it's not relevant anymore, but you always want to see what you have, and that can come obviously from things like analytics. But it gets a lot into voice of the customer, which is something that we'll talk more about in a little bit. But with voice of the customer, that can be surveys, things like that. And sometimes companies have some of those sitting around that one department might have done. And, maybe it was customer service or things like net promoter score, things like that,
Yeah.
that you might be able to start with to help feed that data that you can help use to create personas.
Awesome. And I feel like I should have asked this before, but can you explain in which type of scenario a company would even have you guys create personas or go through the persona process with them?
Yeah, great question. That's so to start with, typically, we always recommend doing that when you're starting a new website. So that's
Okay.
that's kind of the basics. But, and this is maybe getting ahead a little bit, but if there's any large shifts in the industry, or like we just saw with COVID in the world,
Yeah.
there might be times that you want to go back and revisit those, and if you haven't done it before, define them, because that can really help drive the way that you start engaging with users. And also your company, if your company starts doing things differently, maybe they have new products or they're going into a new market, things like that, you'll definitely want to jump into designing some personas.
Is persona development something that you guys on the strategy team, you'd say like takes up a lot of your time, or is it more like that's something that, yes, you guys do, but it's not what you spend a lot of your time in?
There's a big range to that. Sometimes with some clients, when we've had, budget and time is much smaller, that'll be something that, we'll work with what they have.
Yeah.
We'll glean as much information as we can. Ideally, I would say it's something that, we work alongside in tandem with some other strategy items. So, we might be working on business rules and information architecture, and that could go over the course of, several weeks, maybe months. On very large projects, we're getting a lot of data and
Yeah.
a lot of voice of the customer information, but that evolves throughout that process. So it's rarely something that you're going to knock out in a week or a day.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
Ideally, it's something that will evolve as the whole strategy portion of your project evolves.
What's the longest persona development thing you guys have done
Oh,
that you can remember?
yeah, that's a tough one. Well, I guess the first thing I would say is personas like projects are never truly done. There's
Yeah.
always that ongoing aspect. But I mean, I've had some that have gone for months where we've had like a large project, and we're doing a lot of voice of the customer, and sometimes there's a waiting period to get some of that data back, things
Yeah.
like that.
Gotcha.
So that can sometimes take a while. But I don't want to say that to scare anybody from getting into doing personas. I mean, there's definitely, you can work with what you can get, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So we talked a little bit about voice of the customer, including like surveys. So are there any other ways that businesses can gather the necessary data and insights to build accurate and effective personas?
Definitely. So to start with voice of the customer, we've talked about a few things there, but that can be as simple as surveys that are emailed out to users that you already know. It can be reviews that have been left, about your company or products. Sometimes that gets overlooked, and sometimes you take some of those with a grain of salt. There's always those people who are out there, the squeakiest wheel
Yeah.
type.
Hmm.
But there might be a kernel of truth that you can glean from that. Additionally, I mentioned Net Promoter Score, also social media. If you go through your social channels, you can likely find some information that can help form those personas. And another one is focus groups and interviews.
Oh,
And that one can be a little scary to some people. It's definitely something that's a little more involved, but there are a lot of online based solutions out there now for that, which makes it a lot easier to spin up and to do on a faster timeline
yeah.
than used to be, because used to you have to physically get everybody to one place
Yeah,
and
yeah.
do that.
Yeah, I feel like now
And
they have services where you can like call in or be on a Zoom call or something and do it that way.
exactly. So there's ways you can go about that. And to successfully complete voice of the customer for a project, I mean, there's really no expectation that you always have to have all of those. So like I
Yeah.
said before, try to do what you can, what your timeline and your budget will allow. Sometimes maybe you make a version of your personas using two of those now, and hopefully in a year or two you can circle back and start building on that with more information
Yeah.
and more data. So that's always what I would recommend, especially to clients who feel like they can't do a lot right now, and then you can build on that as you go. Another area that I think gets overlooked a lot is customer service teams. These are people who are regularly engaging with the end users. They might not be engaging with every type of persona, but they typically will have a lot of insights that can really help drive personas. A few years ago, probably about 6 years ago now, we had a project where we had about 5 people in a room. We were getting some pretty good information, and we thought we were going in a good direction. And then we pulled in the customer service team. We had about 3 people who were regularly on calls with people, and then also the supervisor. And I felt like the floodgates opened when they started talking, because we learned so much more.
Yeah.
So, I always try to push for customer service to have a seat at the table when you do personas, because they really know what people are thinking, because they get told it, and
Every
some
day.
every day,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
sometimes they're not told it in a nice way,
Yeah.
unfortunately, but
Yeah.
they've got so much experience that they can share, and so it's very valuable.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't even think about something like that, and it seems like that's a great place to start.
Yeah, and one last one too. I had alluded to this before, but again, sometimes there might be previous strategy or marketing work that you can dust off and go through it and figure out what's still relevant. And sometimes you could at least build a simple framework from that, and then build on that. So that's always something I usually ask for as well.
So, what are some common mistakes businesses make when developing personas, and how can they avoid those mistakes?
Yes. So there definitely are a few things that happen, or that can happen, if you're not careful. And I would say the one that's the most common is, and to be honest, this is kind of how it used to be done, was you would just get about 5 or 6 people from the company in a room and spend 2 hours, and you hash it out and you're done. And it seems like a great idea to some
Yeah.
people, but obviously you're leaving the customers out of that. So, that might be a great place to start. And you can start to get some ideas, maybe some preliminary thoughts about, which groups you have. But that's really just the starting point. That's not, the whole complete session.
Yeah, it seems like, people who work inside the company are going to have a way different opinion of the service or the product than the customers actually utilizing them.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's one thing that I definitely push to, make sure that it's clear from the start that, this is the starting point,
Yeah.
but at the end of this, we're not going to be done with the personas. And
Yeah.
along with that process, a thing that we run into sometimes is too few or too many, which is actually happens more often, too many personas. I usually like to keep it between 4 to 6 personas.
Okay.
Sometimes you can get away with fewer, if you have if it's just a very streamlined or focused website or service or something that you're doing. But typically 4 to 6 is a good point to stop. And if you have more than that, then you really have to spend some time to see, hey, can some of these be merged into one? Do some of them share enough of the same goals and pain points that we can whittle this down and not have 12, which occasionally that happens.
Uh-huh.
But if you have that many at one point as you're working through the process, that's okay. But I would definitely recommend spend some time after you have all of those defined to start to see which ones you can eliminate, which ones you can merge, and things like that, because you will knock yourself out trying to come up with content for 12 personas.
Yeah, that seems crazy.
Yeah, it's a lot. So that's probably the other one I would say is pretty common. Yeah, and the other thing too I would say is to make sure that you periodically review your personas. That maybe it's a yearly thing, but but I would say as long as you do that every 2, maybe 3 years, barring any major changes or shifts in your company or in the market, that would be fine. But just make sure you set up a time periodically to review them and see what maybe has changed. Do you have new personas, or do you just need to change, some of the things that you had defined previously?
Yeah. I think that's a wonderful piece of advice, because I feel like, especially right now in today's digital age, things are changing faster than ever before. And so it's like the customers are always, going somewhere else or have different needs. So it's hard to keep up with them if you don't.
Right.
If you don't keep up with them,
Yep.
essentially. So how can businesses ensure that their personas are based on real data and not just assumptions or stereotypes?
Yeah, and that's something I think we, from a high level, kind of touched on before. I mean, we really want to get the customers to a seat at the table. We don't want to just get people from within the company bouncing around ideas about their assumptions, and that goes a long way. Once
Yeah.
you can figure out some channels to bring in those customer voices, that's going to help a lot. If you started with maybe 2 of those types of voice of the customer data previously, maybe you can work over time, working in 1 or 2 more, just to maybe refine and make those personas more accurate.
Hmm.
But I would say that's the biggest part. And then, like we talked about before, customer service, they always have a lot of great insights as well. So I think those 2 things can really help make those personas far less generic or stereotypical,
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah. Awesome. Are there any specific tools or techniques that you recommend for businesses to use when building out their personas?
Sure. So analytics is always a good place, at least just to start, to get a feel for how many users are coming, what content they're consuming, things like that. So that's always a great place just to get your feet wet, essentially.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to voice of the customer, there's a lot of different options out there. I mean, if you Google voice of the customer or focus groups or surveys, you'll find a lot of solutions. But a few other things too to keep in mind is it can be as simple as a newsletter. You can send out a newsletter if you have a list of people. You can link over to a web form, and it could even be a free form, and get some feedback from users very easily that way.
Yeah. That sounds like one way that I feel like I would do,
Yeah,
not like super frequently to overwhelm them, but it just feels like it's the easiest and quickest way to actually get some real feedback.
exactly. There's a very low barrier for entry with that,
Yeah.
which is great. So you don't always have to go and, contract with a third party company. You can start with a Google form
Yeah.
and users you already know, which is
hmm
fantastic. Another thing, and I'm sure a lot of people have seen this, but there are things called website intercept surveys. So it's one of those things that sounds really complex, but almost everybody's experienced them these
Yeah.
days. It's when, you've noticed sometimes when you're, especially on desktop, if you move your cursor up toward to close the tab, and then a little survey pops up.
Oh, yeah.
Those
Every
types of
day I
things.
feel
Yep.
like, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And they've got that, the versions of that for phones as well. Those are also really good because it can capture, when people are looking to leave a site, why are they leaving? Do they
Yeah.
not find what they're looking for? Are they frustrated? Or maybe they're happy. Maybe they did find what they needed, and it's great to hear that. So those are also great tools. And again, anytime you can also get direct interviews or focus groups, that's fantastic as well. I know that's not always an option for every business out there, but those are always great as well.
Awesome. So, how do you think businesses should go about validating and refining their personas over time? We kind of touched a little bit earlier on, going back and reviewing those every 2 to 3 years. But is there any other advice you have within that?
Sure. I would say the biggest thing is to create a feedback loop and plan that out. You can have various, voice of the customer, uh, data points out there, and some that are always running, so you can periodically, maybe every 6 months or once a year, go through all of that information and see if there's any new trends that are emerging from what people are saying. The other thing that I'm also a big analytics person. So another thing that I really like to do is to look to see how I can create reports using data centered around those personas.
What kind
So
of data points do you use?
yeah, and that's the tricky part because that's different for every persona.
Yeah.
So
hmm
sometimes, maybe you can create a funnel, and that's something you could do Google Analytics and many other
Yeah.
tools that follows a process that a certain persona might use. Maybe it's a funnel to purchase or a funnel to consume certain types of information. Other times it is just more simple, simple in quotes, reports that you can set up that focus on specific conversions on the website,
Okay.
things like that,
hmm
or a series of actions that specific personas might do. And so if you can create those reports or dashboards, then periodically you can go through that data and see how those different personas are performing with your website or marketing. And that goes a long way as well because it's constant data that's coming in, and it can always help you improve your personas.
Yeah. Awesome. And I like how, with anything in websites, data and analytics is all, it tells an entire story that all of us could use to learn to better our websites too.
Exactly.
So, how can personas be used in various channels, such as, a business's website and then other digital marketing channels like email, social, newsletters, that kind of stuff?
There's so many different ways that you can that you can use them. So we've talked a lot about websites already. I mean, it's you might want to make sure that navigation and calls to action are all relevant to those personas. So that really informs things like the information architecture and things of that nature. And then also, it gets into the content. Making sure the content and the content voice, really resonates with them. You want to make sure that's speaking to where they're at, essentially. And sometimes it can influence design. Obviously, if you're going for a younger or maybe much older demographic, there's certain design things that come into play.
Oh, yeah. I
So,
didn't even think about that kind of the design too. I
mhm.
always think about the content, obviously, as a content writer and kind of figuring out who, like at AmericanEagle.com, we have marketing and IT are our main kind of people, and then they're spread out from there. So it's interesting to even think about it graphic wise too.
Right. Yeah. That's why it's so great to have personas because there's so many different people who touch a website that can benefit from them and design or plan or write around that.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other things too is with social and in advertising and things like that. It really gets into, again, of course, messaging, sometimes the imagery that might go along with that, and landing pages, where
Yeah.
you're sending them to.
Hmm.
So those are all critical. And similar to that, I would say email as well, because the nice thing is with email, you can have so many different groups of users that you can email, and it might be for the same thing, but you can change that messaging accordingly to
Yeah,
the persona.
absolutely.
Yep.
And have different like automated campaigns kind of sending different. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
So, are there any trends or emerging practices in persona development that businesses should be aware of? Have you seen anything in the last like year or so to really come about?
It's really been interesting to see how it's been an evolving trend. I would say the first few times I did personas, they were kind of what the stereotype is of a persona. It's like you have Patty the purchaser, and
Yeah.
those types of
Yeah.
things. And it's fine if you still name things that way, but that was still kind of the mindset. And I would say too, having things like a lot of demographic data, because that used to be how marketing was done.
Yeah.
And with websites, and even online ads, sometimes it's still helpful, but I would definitely say that there's been less of a focus on that and more of a focus on, user behavior and just kind of the empathy with the user, like really
Yeah.
understanding where they're coming from. So, it's a little less hard data driven, even though data is extremely important, but a little bit more just trying to understand them better.
Yeah.
And I would say another thing too, and this is something I personally haven't done, but I have read about, is kind of in tandem with a persona, is something called an empathy map.
Oh, what's
And
that? I've never even heard of that.
yeah, it's kind of an emerging thing, and I like I said, I haven't personally done one, but you take that same data that you just did, and then you start to map out, what this persona says, thinks, does, and feels, and you kind of come up with, it's a diagram, and you kind of come up with what they are thinking at different parts of their journey.
Gotcha.
So that's kind of something that's becoming a little bit more common, and there's different ways of doing that.
Yeah.
We've done some things that touch on some of those same ideas, but in a different format, and we didn't call them empathy maps, but it seems to be potentially crystallizing around that concept.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I like the idea of, having all of that information about each
Mhm.
one of your, potential personas, but it seems like it could be a little bit daunting trying to get all of that information
Right.
aligned and useful. But I mean, I like that. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So that, and again, those are in that scenario, personas are looking at, who they are. And this is getting into, where they are, what they're feeling, things
Yeah.
like that. So that can be extremely useful, especially because, with a website, they might use different parts of the site depending on where they are in their journey, and that can affect how they're feeling.
Yeah.
Are they frustrated? If they're coming to customer service, they might be frustrated, and you want to take that into account.
Yeah.
Versus if they're looking to buy, they're maybe intimidated or excited, things like that.
Yeah. Wow. All interesting things to think about. So, how can businesses effectively communicate their personas to internal team members and other stakeholders to ensure that everyone, is on the same page and understanding of what's going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that gets overlooked a lot. It can be difficult sometimes, especially in some organizations. The size of some organizations can make that difficult. What I would recommend in that case is really, make sure at the beginning that you pull in people from the different teams or from your team, whoever you're working with or sharing these with, and make them part of the process. So, when I talked about before, a great place to start is get the people that you have available in a room and get talking about it. And of course, later get as much voice of the customer into that. But, if you can pull those people in at the beginning and, get them in on that vision and to understand what you're doing with this and how it informs, almost everything that you can do with a website, then I think that would go a long way in helping them to become more involved and wanting to see the results. And, again, also making sure that they understand that, okay, in this 2 or 3 hour session we're doing now, that's not going to be the end of the
Yeah.
personas.
Yeah.
These will evolve a lot over time. making sure that's clear. But I think that can help raise the bar and get people more excited for it and willing to use them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like most things, communication is key right there, isn't
Exactly.
it?
Yeah, definitely.
So, do you have any tips or best practices for businesses that are just beginning to develop their personas?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, really start small. If you have to, that's fine. You can, if you don't have a big budget, like I said before, you could do it as simple as a Google form that's
Yeah.
capturing information. So, if you have to, start small, and that will get the ball rolling. And then once you start getting some information and start using the personas, maybe you have to justify expenses, things like that. You can start to do that, and you can start adding in, maybe if you want to start doing more voice of the customer, put more budget behind that, then you can start to make that case. So I would say, yeah, start with what you got and expand from there. Talk to other people within your organization, see what data might already exist that you didn't know about, and gather all that together and get started. Again, if for whatever reason you don't think you can do all of your personas to start with, start with maybe two. Try to work
Yeah.
on your largest ones, the biggest groups that you have, and that can be a great starting point.
I just thought of one question that I didn't ask you before. And what, in your opinion, do you think is the consequence of not having personas? Like, I know
Mhm.
you can always define your persona more, but what if you just have nothing? What are the consequences of that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because essentially what you end up with is the opposite of a user-centric website. That's the goal, is you want a user-centric website. And if you don't have personas, typically every person involved with the website, and what I mean by that is, the content writers, the designers, all those different people will just bring their own ideas
Yeah.
and what they think users want. And you end up with a very scattered strategy, essentially, because you almost don't have a strategy
Yeah.
there.
Hmm.
So it's everybody's own take on what needs to be there. And you end up with a lot of fragmentation, and you really, at the end of the day, just aren't meeting the needs of your users.
Good to know. I hope everyone takes that into account. Well, Joel, that was all of the questions I had for you today. Thank you so much for joining Modern Marketing Messages. I learned a ton today about personas, and I really had no idea a lot about personas. So thank you for joining us. And I'm sure people will take away a lot from this episode as well.
Well, thank you. It's been great to be here.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to Modern Marketing Messages. For more information about the topics discussed today, check out the description of this episode. If you like this episode, follow the podcast wherever you listen to stay up to date with us. While you're at it, give us a rating and share this podcast with others. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Modern Marketing Messages. This episode is brought to you by AmericanEagle.com Studios. I'm Taylor Karg, and I'll be back with another Modern Marketing Message.